Hi, in this demo we'll be using a workflow for an approval process. The example we'll be using is customer management. So we have a very basic table with some customer information like the VAT, the address and stuff like that. We have field operators that can request a change in the address part of the customer information, but the change has to be reviewed by backoffice. It can be either approved or rejected. And as an additional requirement, we added a fictional legacy reasoning that all cities and street names have to be capitalized. So let's go to developer and create this application. Let's start by adding a database. In that database, we want to add the table for customer. Let's give it a primary key ID. Let's add some informational fields like the VAT, the name, and then the address part. We'll take the city and the street name and the street number. So this is our customer table. Let's create it. Let's make sure it syncs to the database and synchronize it. So now we have a table for customer. We want to add two applications, one for back office and one for the field operators. Let's start with the back office. Let's add an application and let's open it. So we first need to create an administrative user. Let's do that. And as always, it will now start loading a lot of files necessary to show the application. So we can focus on the customer. In this application, we want to be able to create new customers and update them. So the easiest way to do that is to add an interaction for our customer. And with this interaction, we can immediately start listing all the customers in the database and creating new ones. Although we do have an additional requirement. When we create a new customer, we want the city and the street name to be capitalized as per the requirement. So we can't use this directly. We need to wrap it in another service. Let's do that. So we go to the repository. We have our back office application and let's add a REST folder. In that REST folder, let's add a folder for customer. And in there, let's add a REST service create. We'll make it a post. We'll put it at the path customer. And as input, we can actually use the data type from the interaction. So we have the type here. We have the create input. Let's also add the create output. And we can switch to the implementation tab. We can actually reuse the create, as you can see. But instead of simply drawing the complete structure, which at this point would have the normal name of the city and the street name, we want to capitalize it. So let's instead map the fields separately. So these can be mapped immediately. And then let's add an uppercase for the city. And let's add another uppercase for the street name. And we can map the output here. So now we are still using the interaction, but we're wrapping in additional logic, which will make sure that we uppercase all the strings. So we have our REST service here. Let's go back to our application. Let's log in. And we're greeted by Page Builder. Let's add, as always, a skeleton. In that skeleton, we'll add a top menu. Let's remove the placeholder. So now we have our menu. Let's go back to pages. Let's add customers overview page. Let's put it at the path customers. And on this page, we can use the list. So let's use the list here. And let's display it as a table. In this table, we want to hide the ID. We want to bring the name upwards. And the VAT perhaps even before that. So now we have our table. We can even see what it looks like with some dummy data. And now we want to add the create. If we take this create, we would be creating it with whatever we actually enter, but we want to uppercase the city and the street names. Let's use this create. Let's go into edit mode. We drag drop the create. And as you can see, we have a form. In that form, let's again bring the name up. Let's also bring the VAT up. We can even style the form a little bit. For example, we could say, let's make a field group of the street name, and then we can have the street number join at street group. So now we have the form here. And we need to bind it to an event from here. So let's add an event. Let's say create customer. It's a global event, and we'll do create customer as label, and we'll make it a primary. So we have our button, which is emitting the event create customer. What we want to do now is we want to link that to the cell. So we can take the eventing tab, we can use the event as the requirement to show on, and in a prompt, or maybe in this case we'll do it in a sidebar, just to show you what that would look like. So now we can create new customer in the sidebar. So let's add a test customer with some VAT number, the city Antwerp, street name some street, and the number like this. We added it, but this is not refreshing because we did not add a refresh event. What we can do here in the form settings, we can send out an event once the form is successful. So create that customer, for example. And then in this table, we can say refresh the data when you see this event. So let's add a second customer, another test customer with some VAT. Let's put this one in Brussels, another street, and a number 60. So now this is refreshing. We also see that the city and the street name are being uppercased as we want it to be. Okay, so now we want to add a workflow so that field operators can ask for a change in these three fields. So let's go back here and let's create a workflow. Let's call it customer address change request. So we have our workflow here. Every workflow starts from initial state. So let's call it initial. It can be called whatever, but we usually call it initial. Then from the initial state, we'll go to a state requested change. And from the requested change, we have an approved or a rejected. So these are the states. Now let's add the transitions. So from initial, we can request a change. We can then approve it, or we can reject it. So the transitions are actually the paths from one state to another state, and they allow you to perform logic. So let's go to the request state first. Here we want to ask for a new city, street name, and street number. So we want new address information to be added. We also want it to be added to a particular customer ID, so let's add the customer ID as well. So this can be the input for our transition. In this particular case, we want to save the transition state in the workflow state. So let's go to the workflow. We have our type here. We can actually just use this one and add it to the workflow properties. Let's call this the address change. And then at this point, we can simply map the transition properties here. So this will now be saved. The workflow can stop here and can just wait for a day, a week, 5 weeks, doesn't really matter. It will keep the change request active here. At some point, someone from back office can come in, he can see the data, and he can either approve it or reject it. If we approve it, we want to apply it. So let's create a utility service. Let's make a folder services. Now let's add a block service. Let's call it apply address change. We'll take the transition properties again, and we'll add it as the input here. Let's call it address change. And we want to apply it to the customer. So let's first get the customer. So we can do get by ID. So now we have the current customer. We could even say, okay, if we cannot find a customer, let's throw an exception with the message customer not found. And then we can take our input and we can map it here. So we have the city, which should be uppercased as per the requirement. And we'll uppercase the street name as well. And we'll just map the street number. So now we have our updated customer here. Let's persist it to the database. We can just run a CDBC update, and it will now be updated in database. So this service is done, and we can plug it in. So let's plug it in here to the map step. We can just drag and drop it. We can take the properties we have from the workflow, and we can just map it here. So this will actually apply the change. On rejection, we want a reason. So you cannot just simply reject without giving a reason. And let's save that reason at the workflow level as well. From a workflow perspective, it's an optional field because it will only be filled in if we reject. If we go to rejection, we can take the reason, we can map it to the workflow properties, and it will be persisted. So now our workflow is pretty much done. Let's build an application for our field officers. We do add application. Let's call it field operator. So let's open it up. We have to create an admin user. Again, the application has to load. We'll just wait for it to finish. Let's log in with our user. We're again greeted by page builder. Let's again add a skeleton. Just make it look the same. So also use the top menu, remove the placeholder, go back to pages, and we'll add a customer overview page. Let's put it at the path customers. Let's go here. At this point, we could reuse the interaction from the back office, but let's make a new one for field operators because we want to limit what they see. For whatever reason, we don't want them to see the vet. So we remove the vet, we see that it's gone. We go back to the application, and we can drag in the list. At this point, we'll use the card simply to make it look slightly different. Let's save this and exit edit mode. So now we have our cards here. As you can see, we cannot see the vet here. Let's actually remove the ID as well. It's useless information. And at this point, we want a button per customer where we can request a change. Let's go into edit mode. Let's add an event. Let's call it request change. We give it the label request change and we'll make it primary. So now this button per card will send out an event with the data of the card in it as a payload. So if we click this, we want to start the workflow. So we want to do the request change. Now we have our form. Let's remove some of the values that we are not really interested in. For example, these are not really relevant for this context. Let's just move them out. An actual application will probably wrap this in a custom REST service. For the demo, this is by far the easiest way to do it. So we have the street name, street number. Let's remove this, this, and this. We don't want to use the fill in the customer ID manually, but we do want the value binding from the event. So let's take the event and click automap. As you can see, they will be automatically pre-filled. The customer ID is not pre-filled because it is matched on name, and name is actually ID. So let's do it like this. So now these values will be pre-filled from the event. Let's also make sure that the cell is only shown when the event occurs, and let's do it in a prompt. So when we click on this one, for example, we see the data that is for this customer. When we click here, we get that data. Let's request that this customer is moved to Antwerp. And he moves into yet another street, and the number 32. Now we started a workflow for this customer. Let's go back to the back office application and let's add a view on the workflow. If we reload, we can see that the customer is not actually being changed. He's still in Brussels, another street, because we still have to review the workflow. Let's go to the repository. Let's add a service here. Let's do list requests. It's a get on, for example, customer change request. And what we want to return is a list of all the open change requests. So let's add a structure, open change request. What is in it? At the very least, our address change. So let's call this the address change again. And let's also add the workflow ID. This will allow us to easily call the other transitions. We'll also add the state ID, and you'll see why later on. So now we have this response. Also add a list, because that's the actual output. So open change request list, for example. Let's just drag drop this. We have the requests, and this will be the output of the REST service. Now we want to get the workflows for the definition of this one, and we're interested in the running workflows. So when we look at the workflow, any state that is not final is considered a running workflow. Once we reach a final state, it is considered no longer running. So let's add this here. So we have our workflow instances. Let's loop over them. And let's loop into the output here. So what we want to do now is we want to get the properties of the workflow, because that's where the address change is actually residing. Let's take the workflow ID and definition ID. You can see the output is actually a list of key value pairs with some additional metadata. Let's do properties to object. Okay. And we have to use the type of the workflow properties here. Let's map this. And now we have our workflow properties. So now we have the address change we're looking for. Now let's add this to the request. So we have the workflow properties here. We also have the ID, state ID, like this. So if we now run it, we can see the request that was created. So this REST service is now finalized. Let's go back to our application. Let's add a new page. Let's call it customer change requests. Let's put it at the path change requests. And in here, we want to take that REST service. So let's add the list as a table. And as you can see, we now have these values. Let's tweak them a little bit. We don't want to see the state ID or the workflow ID. And these labels can be simpler. Let's just remove these. Okay, so now we have this. Let's also remove the customer ID. Now you can see the request information here, but obviously it's not very clear which customer this is about. So let's update the REST service. We have our change request here. Let's just add the customer from the database. So we have the customer here. Let's add it to the definition. If we then go back to our REST service, we can see that the customer has been added. There's a number of ways to fill in the customer depending on the requirements on performance. We'll just take the easiest solution for now. We'll just take the get here inside the loop, and let's just map the customer. If we now run this, we can see that the REST service has been updated and we now have the customer information as well. Let's go back to our application. And now in here, we actually have some new fields. So let's add from the dropdown the customer name. Let's call it customer name. Let's move to the front. And then it might be interesting to see the old value. So we have the city here. Let's add the current city. So let's add some text. Currently. And then we'll take the current value, which is in the customer. We have the city here. We can obviously do the same for street name and street number, but you can see now the new value and the old value, and then you can decide whether you want to approve or reject it. So let's add two events, an approve event. Just give the label approve and the class success. And let's add a reject, which will give the class danger, and will add the message reject. So now we have two events for each record. Let's plug in the workflow. We open up the workflow again. We have the transitions. Let's drag drop. So we have the approve and the reject. For the approve, it automatically generates a form, but we don't actually need it at this point. So let's get rid of it. For the reject, we do want the form because we have the reason here. So let's remove these and let's make the reason a text area. So you have more room to actually type the reason. And now we need to hook up the events to actually do something. So we go to the page, we add a trigger on the event. So we trigger on approve, for example. Let's say approve workflow as name. And what we want to do is we want to call the approve. At this point, we do have to give it a workflow ID. We can get that from the approve. And we have the workflow ID here. So now if we click on the approve, this will be triggered. If we click on the reject, we want the form to show. So let's have the show on reject in a prompt. And then when you click, we also want to bind the workflow ID. So again, we take it from here. And when these triggers are done, we want the table to be updated again. So let's go back to the events and let's enable reload. Okay. So now we have our page. We can either approve or reject. If we reject, we can give a reason, or we can simply approve it. Let's approve it. As you can see, the workflow is now gone. Let's go to our customer page. As you can see, now both are in Antwerp with yet another street. So what is the reason that we added the state ID? To show you, we should go back to the field operator application. Let's do that. Well, let's request another change. We have Antwerp here. Let's change this one. Let's change him to Brussels. Let's do him to Sesame Street and some vague number. Okay, so now we have requested the change. If you go back to the back office application and we reload, we get the new workflow. What we can do now is we can also visualize this workflow. We can actually add what we call the workflow diagram here. This is actually a visual representation of the workflow in the front end. We do need to fill in some cell settings. So we want the definition ID. Let's get that from the workflow definitions. And we want the state ID, which is why I was adding it. But we still need to have a selection event. So let's actually go back to the table. Let's add a select workflow event. And then we go back to the diagram and we can map that from the select workflow. We have the state ID here. Okay, so now we can always see the workflow, and when we select the workflow, we can see in which state it is. One more thing we can do is we can also add the finalized workflows. So let's do that. Let's update this request to not only allow the running ones, but let's add a query parameter to enable us to choose whether we want the running ones or not. Let's make it a Boolean and singular. Okay. And then instead of hard coding it here, the running, let's actually get it from the input. So now we've updated this REST service. Let's go back to our application. And by default, we're not filling in the running at all. So we see all the workflows. Let's limit this table to show only the running. So we can do the mapping here. We can say we want the running ones. So now we want this table a second time, but with the finalized requests. So what we can do is we can actually take this entire row, we can copy it, and let's paste it. Let's move it upwards, and we have the same twice. But in this case, we want the mapping to be false. And we should get rid of the events in this case, because we don't want to be able to reject or approve. We do want the selection event because we want the diagram to update. Let's also update the title. Let's call this finalized requests. And if we select one here, you can see that this change is highlighted. And when you select one here, you can say this one is highlighted. If we, for example, reject this one, we say this is not a valid address. Now we see that the request is moved to the finalized one, and we can see that it is now rejected, and this one is approved. We can also obviously visualize that here, so let's add the field. And we have state ID. Let's format it as a workflow state. And then you can see the final state here. So now we have two applications here, which will open in the browser. So we have our back office application, which has no homepage yet, but let's go straight to the customer change. And then we have the field operator application, which will also open in the browser. Also no homepage here yet. Let's go to the customer overview, and let's pretend that we're in mobile mode. So the field operator is using his cell phone. He is at this customer. He can say, okay, let's request a change. He wants to move again to Brussels. We just keep making up streets and numbers. Okay, so the change has been requested. And our back office might be using a tablet, so he sees the request incoming. He can also view all the requests. And he can say, okay, let's approve this one. And now you can see that it's been approved. So that's it for the workflow demo. Of course, there's a ton more that can be done with the workflow engine. There is asynchronous tasks. You can schedule transitions. You can retry, obviously, certain steps. There's a ton more that you can do with workflows. This is merely meant as a very basic introduction. I hope it was interesting. See you next time.